So the topic of today's video is a little different than, and the format is a little different than some of the videos I've done in the past. What I wanted to do was start with a rundown of what exactly I'm using and kind of go through the details of what I'm doing right now and why. I think what's great about pedals and what they teach you is the signal flow of an instrument or an instrument source in a recording program. Say, for example, a vocal, how a drum is processed, how a bass is processed, how anything is processed in a recording studio, and the pieces of the chain and the the different plugins and effects that are used in a digital studio, and how a mixing console worked. I learned a lot of this in my lessons from using guitar pedals. So here you see my completed setup. I condensed my rig down so that it can fit inside my new briefcase. And on the top here we have just my basic effects, modulation, distortion, 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 preamp, two channels of preamp with a cab sim so I can run into the system, post EQ, and delay and reverb. And the reason I redid my rig this way is so that not only can I fit it inside this board, but I can have all my essentials in one simple portable rig, but also adapt in my other pedals on an auxiliary board. And I just want to show you guys some of the wiring that I did here. So I'm going to flip the board over and show you. So, and this is all, carefully secured, combination of zip ties and Velcro. You can see on the back here that I actually used some cable management kind of stickies and combinations of cable ties to tie down all the power. And it's fairly clean. I mean, every channel is run, my power supply's zip tied up near the front. And so that way I'm not worried about pinching cables or accidentally stepping on something or pinching it as it's in transit. And I think that's a really important factor for having a good rig, is making sure that nothing's going to get damaged in transit and that nothing's rubbing against each other and that every connection is good while still keeping everything very compact. And those lessons, obviously, it took a lot of experience and trial and error, but let's plug in the rig and see how it sounds. So the rig fired up just right and everything works and sounds great, so check it out. Yeah, I'm hearing all the effects I want to hear. The tone is fixed. Putting the graphic EQ post preamp, which is my amp sim, into this very clean solid state amp. This is going to be just like what it sounds like when I play live rigs, and I think it's really critical to get that same feel, and I'm really enjoying it. Now, I started with guitar pedals when I was about 13, probably about a year into playing. I bought my first pedal. And ironically, it was a death metal pedal. I really thought that gain sound, maximum gain, is what I would want. And as it turns out, that was not the case, and it took a while before I finally found the sweet spot for the level of distortion for a good pop-punk type sound and a good, like, naturals amp distortion type sound, like some of the gear I have today. That took a few years, and it's a lot of trial and error. But to get back to my greater point, a lot of how the controls on a guitar pedal work are greatly indicative of how a lot of different other pieces of hardware and other programs work. So with most of these pedals here, you have, for example, an input and an output volume. So as whatever source you're putting in, you need to control that level and the level of that input as it cascades into an output. So if you want more of that sound, you want more push to that sound, you need more input gain. So more gain, as it's typically listed on a lot of pieces of hardware and software. And then in order to keep that sound managed, you have a volume or a master level control. And that kind of will be your overall level, is in using a mix fader or something. So, in a mixer you have the input at the top, and that's how much signal is coming in, and then shaping it with the tone controls on a mixer. You have bass, treble, mid, etc., and how those are, the instrument comes in, there's that initial volume, and getting that matched to, so where it can be coming in, nice and clean, but still at a good volume, how it's shaped, and then a master volume. That was taught to me by simple pedals. I had an input tone, or maybe some EQ, and an output. And I learned a lot of my lessons from pedals that way. One of the biggest ways that I learned from pedals was how reverbs and delays are impacted by where they are in the chain. So if I say, for example, in a recording program, I have my guitar and it is plugged into a reverb, that is very different than if I do all my shaping and processing and then put the reverb on. And, learning the subtleties of the placement of each effect and each processing choice and how that affects a lot of how it sounds by where it is placed, and that placement piece. So with a pedal board, you have multiple, effects and pieces of processing, and then depending on the order they are in, how that is affected. So with guitars, whether or not you have a modulation pedal, a chorus reverb, or a chorus tremolo, phaser, flanger, those kinds of effects that are actually still time based, like a delay, those modulation effects have a very different sound if they are before, after some of the other processing, because you are then shaping a already chorused sound, or you are chorusing an already processed sound. And those are two very different things. And I know it sounds very similar, and most of this is actually pretty easy to understand. But, so for example, with my guitar rig, to get it to sound the best, I have my chorusing first, then my distortions, which are kind of the shaping and the main tone of what I'm accomplishing. So I am distorting the chorus instead of, chorusing the distortion, because it's very subtle if it's early on. It's too heavy, I find, and too heavily affected if it's after. And some people like it. You have to learn which way you like the effect that it sounds best for your taste and style. And so, for example, I'm running this as if it were an amp, right? So I have my chorus, and then my distortions, and then I have an actual mini preamp. This is essentially a small digital amp in a pedal form that I'm using here. And then after that amp, I have a graphic EQ with sliders. And what I'm doing, because I know that sound is a little mid-heavy and I don't like certain frequencies, I want to shape that with my graphic EQ. And level-wise, that also has a gain, so I can turn that down slightly. And then I run that into my delay. So the delay is late in the chain, so everything else is being delayed after. If you can put delay before distortion, before amp, before a lot of things, and then what it's doing is the trails, the repeats of that guitar at the lower volume are then being processed by everything, and it is a more distorted, mushier kind of sound, because it is then being processed by everything else. So I like it late in the chain because I find it to be the cleanest. I like that effect of it more. But again, you can put things anywhere in any order you want in order to create a sonic landscape that you find interesting and appealing. There's no hard and fast rules for what has to work for you. I'm just saying, in my experience, I like my delay after my amp, after my preamp, after my processing and saturation. And then the very last thing for me is reverb. Now, reverb could be placed before the amp, it could be placed the very first thing, it can be the very last thing, like it is for me. And those all have very subtle changes, and you learn over time what works for you. And that's what I learned from my pedal board. I learned these lessons based on my experiences with each of these pieces of gear and how I felt they would best sound and what I found to be the best application of that effect. And it took a lot of experimenting, but what was great, and something I learned by using actual physical hardware, is that it got me down on my hands and knees, tweaking knobs, hearing the differences by having a physical sensation. I think some of that's missed in some of the, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great digital processing out there right now. It's very affordable, it sounds really good, and there's no real drawbacks to using digital other than for some people, I find they get a better sound when they're able to get their hands on some knobs and tweak it to taste, rather than, okay, I flick on a preset that is an entire set of processing that someone else came up with and it's a great sound. I think that's great, and I use those kinds of tools in my arsenal as well. If I go into a studio, I want kind of plug and play stuff, especially to get an idea down right away. Perfect example of this is the song that I have on my channel that's recent in the last week or so that I recorded in a couple hour period because I was able to sit down with my guitar, get my idea out right away, and I had some plug and play digital amp tools that made it very easy to get the sounds I was after. And a lot of those, you know, the delays and reverb sounded great. The gain sound was great, and I hardly had to tweak anything because I was able to hear the sound that I wanted. But if I had sat there and dialed in a sound by hand, I would have, you know, it's a more rewarding, teachable experience. I learned more. I learned about how a chorus can sound. I learned all the different variations of a chorus by having a chorus pedal. You know, a phaser or flanger or tremolo. I learned how those things worked by having individual effects where I had to sit there and dial in the sound till I got it right. And I think that's the key that I want to communicate with this video, is by having physical hardware, having to get down and tweak some knobs, you really learn what does and doesn't work for you for those effects, rather than just kind of clicking through some presets that sound wild and you're like, okay, that's what a tremolo, phaser, flanger, you know, reverb delay does. But I think everyone needs to at least experience this to some degree, working with some actual physical hardware. I think it's just a great teachable experience. And you know, some of you are so experienced, you've had it all, you've tried it all, you know it works, you know it doesn't. And you know, I get it, I'm there too. But I found for my rig, for my live rig right now, I want my guitar, some pedals, and an amp. And sometimes I can plug this rig straight into a PA through a DI. I could plug this into recording software. And on its own, it's a standalone system because of how I designed it. But that being said, never be afraid to get some old school hardware, get a cheap pedal, just to learn the ins and outs of some physical hardware again, to have to come up with a sound on your own from scratch. I think it's so rewarding. So I really appreciate you checking out this video. I hope it helped you. I hope you found it interesting. And like and subscribe and continue to check out my videos if you find them interesting. I'll have plenty of talk pieces, topics. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to get them answered. And thank you so much for checking out what I'm doing lately.